Thank you for joining us this evening. You are attending the webinar entitled Deliciousness and the Evolution of Flavor. Our leader for this session is Robert R. Dunn, Senior Vice Provost for University Interdisciplinary Programs, North Carolina State University. I also want to note that we are joined tonight by Julianne Farkas, Pinecrest, Florida. Julianne, thank you for joining us. Julianne is a member of this year's Teacher Advisory Council who will serve as our TA for tonight's session. She will be active in the chat, sharing thoughts and resources and asking questions. Dr. Rob Dunn serves as Senior Vice Provost for University Interdisciplinary Programs at NC State University. In this role, Dunn oversees Office of University Interdisciplinary Programs, which includes the Chancellor's Faculty Excellence Program, Academies, the Biotechnology Program, the Coastal Resilience and Sustainability Initiative, NC State Innovation and Entrepreneurship, the Integrative Sciences Initiative, and the Shelton Leadership Center. He has worked alongside university leaders and campus partners to stand up the office and is responsible for equipping new interdisciplinary initiatives for success, continuing to support existing initiatives, and achieving the office's strategic goals. Dunn also holds the William Neal Reynolds Distinguished Professorship in the Department of Applied Ecology, where he devotes 20% of his time. He has been a member of the NC State faculty since 2005. Dunn manages the Rob Dunn Lab on campus, is co-coordinator of the Leadership and Public Science Cluster in the Chancellor's Faculty Excellence Program, a member of the advisory board of the Triangle Center for Evolutionary Medicine, and serves on the executive committee of NC State's Department of Applied Ecology. Dunn's research has been awarded tens of millions of dollars in grants from no fewer than 12 different sources for work in 20 different countries. Dunn received his Bachelor of Arts in Biology from Kalamazoo College and his PhD in Ecology and Evolution from the University of Connecticut. He is an avid writer and has published many popular articles in National Geographic, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, among many others, as well as 7 books. Most recently, A Natural History of the Future and Delicious, The Evolution of Flavor and How It Made Us Human, with Monica Sanchez. To our network of teachers, both nationally and internationally, and without further ado, I present to you our scholar and our leader for this session, Rob Dunn. Rob, we are honored to have you with us tonight, and we look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you so much, Mike. I was enjoying hearing you speak. I was happy to let you keep going.
Well, I'm glad you're here, Rob. Thank you.
It's my great pleasure. Well, thank you everybody for joining us tonight, thank you for tuning in after a busy day at work. I'm actually going to talk about 2 books and a connection between them. So I'm going to talk about the book Delicious, The Evolution of Flavor and How It Made Us Human, and then segue into a little bit of a natural history of the future. And the common thread that I'll be thinking about as I go through this are the ways in which the details of our biology influence the past and also influence the kinds of futures we can think about. But I'm going to start with flavor, deliciousness, pleasure, which in our daily lives I think fascinate many of us. If we think about the history of art, these have been things that have been central for a long time. In the Renaissance, depictions of food and pleasure displaced gods and kings. And so you got great wheels of cheese where you once had a king or a god. You got pretzels, you got drinks. And for the early Impressionists, food provided a way to connect with realistic moments. For the post-Impressionists, food prompted questions about the brain and senses. How little did you have to depict in order for the brain to see and to make sense of an image? And then for writers as well, food is really central. Pleasure is central. I really like this poem by William Carlos Williams, who writes, "To a poor old woman, munching a plum on the street, a bag of them in her hand, they taste good to her. They taste good to her. They taste good to her. You can see it by the way she gives herself to the one half sucked out in her hand. comforted a solace of ripe plums seeming to fill the air, they taste good to her. And so food and pleasure, they're central. We think about them. We think about them when we eat. We think about them when we're around each other. But for reasons of a peculiar history, in my field, things are different. I'm an evolutionary biologist and a community ecologist. As an evolutionary biologist, I tend to think about relatedness, evolution, and comparisons among species. And as a community ecologist, I tend to think about interactions among species. And food is central to my field, but not flavor or deliciousness, which is a really intriguing feature. And yet animals eat, and yet animals choose, and yet animals choose by flavor and by pleasure. You know, this crow is making a decision to eat those French fries, and we don't have trouble thinking that part of why it's doing that is because those French fries are delicious. But we've not really studied that as scholars. And so one of the things we do in this book is to revisit the evolution of animals and especially the evolution of humans while focusing on flavor. And I'm going to walk you through that a little bit tonight. And our core argument is that in many of the key transitions in human evolution, flavor played a role. And when confronted with a more delicious food and a less delicious food, our ancestors tended to choose the more delicious food. They chose what tasted good to them. And from such choices, much follows. Doesn't seem radical, but it has a number of conclusions that can be a little bit radical. In the book, we talk about all of these features: tool use, evolution of big brains, the origin of culture, megafaunal extinction, avocados, which are delicious, but it's mysterious why they're delicious. If you want to talk about that in the questions, I'm glad to. Fermentation, spice use, art, food sharing, and more. I'm just going to talk about a couple of these today. And what I'm going to start with is tool use. And to talk about tool use, I actually want to back up a little bit. I want to back up about 4.5 billion years to think about how taste and tool use, flavor and tool use, deliciousness and tool use relate. And to do this, what I need you to do is to think about a time when our ancestors lived in the ocean. And even a time before vertebrates, before animals, when our ancestors were single-celled organisms in an ocean long ago. And when they were, there was an evolutionary opportunity wherein those original cells could have been composed of any of a variety of elements. And so you could imagine that natural selection, that evolution, could make different cells out of different things. But in practice, what happened is that natural selection favored the evolution of cells, of ancestral single-celled beings, in which the most common elements were those that were common in ocean water. And so natural selection took advantage of what was available and commonly available. And so this figure on the x-axis, the horizontal one, just shows the percentage of different elements in ocean water. And so you see oxygen way at the top on the right there. You see carbon, you see nitrogen, you see calcium as the Ca. And on the y-axis, the up and down one, is the percent by mass in single-celled marine organisms. And so the things that are common in the sea are more common in single-celled organisms. What's interesting is if you look at any other creature in the ocean, any other being in the ocean, this is also true. In general, in the ocean, natural selection tended to favor organisms that took advantage of the common things. But the trick here is that about 380 million years ago, our ancestors, our vertebrate ancestors, dragged themselves out of the ocean and onto the shore. And when they did, they had a problem, a big problem actually, because what you see now is the percent by mass in animals of different elements. And so at the far right, you have carbon, then oxygen, then nitrogen. And so you see the things on the right, again, are those things that were common in the ocean. And the circles are the means for different kinds of animals. The different colors are for fish, mammals, and insects, respectively. We can just look at the circles. On the y-axis, you have the percent difference between plants and animals. And so those things that are high on this chart are far more common in animals than in plants. And so the problem with for these vertebrates that crawled onto shore is that now there was a huge disconnect between what was common in their bodies and what was common in plant food. And so if you're a vertebrate that's eating plants, how do you get enough sodium, Na, or phosphorus, P, or even nitrogen, N? And this is a trickier question than it seems. And one thing you can do is you can poop a lot. And so you just ingest tons and tons of food and you poop out the things that you don't need as much of. And this is what aphids do. And so aphids ingest tons and tons of phloem or xylem from plants, depending on the species. And then they just excrete lots and lots of what they don't need in order to get enough of what they do need. And ants form a relationship with aphids because they actually like the stuff the aphids don't need. But this is a bad way to live as a human, right? Like this is imagine if your students were just constantly excreting all over the place to balance their elemental needs. It's a bad classroom. So what does an animal do? How does a raccoon, an omnivore, find the right ratios of elements in its food so that it can build its cells, build its bodies? Well, what we argued a number of years ago, and what we talk about in the book, is that the way animals tend to do this is through taste. And so taste receptors largely evolved to allow animals to find those things they needed more of, and to then reward them for doing so. And so if you look at the salty taste receptor, it's rewarding us for finding sodium. The phosphorus, we have phosphorus taste receptors. In other animals, they're clearly really important. We don't quite know how they work in humans. We have calcium taste receptors. Again, we don't totally know how they work in humans, but they're there. And then we have umami taste receptors, which if you taste something that's savory, that's that umami taste. And so like a ham and cheese sandwich with a tomato on it and it tastes just right, that just right savoriness is the umami taste receptor. And then we have sweet taste receptors that are a little bit different. They're not rewarding us for finding a particular element. They reward us for finding sources of lots of calories. And so they're rewarding us for finding sugar. And then bitter taste receptors are different. So most of the taste receptors, they have a single kind of receptor that's wired to a sweet sensation or a salty sensation. And it really intercepts one sort of group of kinds of molecules, sugars or salts. We have 25 different bitter taste receptors, and they're all wired in your brain to a single perception, bitter. And so your brain doesn't actually distinguish the different kinds of bitter, but your tongue does. The body knows even if the brain doesn't. And the reason that this conveys the single sensation to your brain is that this is a warning. Bitter is a warning. This is a food you should avoid. Now, we've learned to eat some foods that are bitter, that are safe in certain kinds of consumption, but in general, bitter is a warning. Sour is a totally different sort of taste. Ask me some other day over a coffee or wine. Someday, if many of you are in LA, if I'm out there, we could talk sour. If we have time, I'll talk sour. Sour is super fascinating and relates to fermentation. And then the other thing we see is if we look at evolutionary transitions in other lineages, we see changes in taste receptors that match changes in their biology. And so carnivores don't have to worry as much about finding the right elements, because if they eat their prey, if they eat the entirety of their prey, they tend to get everything they need because their prey items basically match them in elemental composition. And so we see that many predators actually lose taste receptors. And so even though your cat, you think it loves the sweetness of milk, your cat actually can't taste milk, the sweetness of it. They don't have sweet taste receptors. They're broken. Dolphins appear to have no functional taste receptors. Whatever pleasure they find in food, and clearly they do find pleasure, it's something different. And then we have really fascinating cases that have been discovered recently. So for example, we know that the ancestors of hummingbirds were swifts that fed almost exclusively on insects. And so they had an umami taste receptor to reward them for finding those insects. But eventually those swifts, some of them evolved to feed more and more on nectar. And that umami taste receptor evolved so it intercepted both sweet things and umami things. And so whatever the sensation in the brain of hummingbirds for finding nectar is, it's actually the same as eating insects. So an insect and sugars taste the same to a hummingbird. And then we have dogs where we know that since we domesticated dogs, what's going on in their mouths has changed. Excuse me. And not so much their taste receptors, but they have extra copies of an amylase gene, and that amylase gene produces amylase, which breaks down starch. And the amylase is produced in the mouths of dogs, and it breaks down the starch and turns it into simple sugars. And so when dogs eat your pasta, they actually taste it as sweet. And so dogs were, in essence, rewarded for evolving the ability to like our food. And so there are these rapid evolutionary things that are happening. They're not rapid in the time scale of 10 years, 20 years. They tend to be thousands of years or more, often millions of years. But there are these changes in response to biological changes. So how does this relate to tool use? If we think about tools in general, the very first tools we know about are tools like these. And so these are 1.2 to 2 million year old bone tools that were used by our ancestors to dig out termites. Before this, our ancestors used stick tools. And in general, when paleoanthropologists think about why these tools started to be used, it's in the context of, well, this was an efficient way to get more resources. And in studying tools, you can do it two ways. You can study these tools like this, but there aren't many of them, and it's hard to infer much from them. The other thing you can do, though, to think about tools is you can study our living relatives to figure out why are they using tools and toward what ends. And so that's what I'm going to talk about mostly today. And by good fortune, when we look at the evolutionary tree of humans and our living relatives, we see that orangutans use tools sometimes, gorillas rarely, but both chimps and humans often use tools. And so it's widely accepted that our shared ancestors also use tools. And so maybe by studying chimps, we have a little bit of a lens into our own ancestral tool use. And so how did chimps use tools? Well, we know a lot more about this from studies in recent years that have used camera traps like this to get videos of chimpanzee populations that are not habituated. And so they're chimp populations that don't like humans near them, but the chimps will do their thing in front of the cameras. And so this is like the real life chimpanzee or something. And so this has allowed us to see all sorts of chimpanzee tool use we never knew about before, thanks to this group at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig in Germany that we work with quite often. And I think, let's see, I don't know if the video will work here or not, but maybe not. Oh, maybe it's going. Is it going? Well, what you would see here is a video of the many kinds of ways we now know that chimpanzees use tools. And so chimpanzees use tools we now know to gather algae. So they'll take a long, long stick and wrap algae around it and then suck the algae off of the top of it. They use tools to get termites. They use tools to get ants. They love to use tools to get bees. There's the stick tools of different kinds for each use. They fold up leaves to use as cups for drinking water. In some cases, chimps will take rocks and pile them inside holes in trees. This has emerged repeatedly. We have no idea what it is. Some people speculate it's sort of a chimp religion. But the more we study chimps, the more kinds of tool use we see. And we also see that different populations of chimps use tools for different things. And so the figure on my left is of the yellow are sites where chimps use sticks to eat ants. But in each of those populations, chimps do this a little bit differently, and baby chimps will learn to do it a little bit differently. At the right are populations where chimps use sticks to get termites. Again, it's different in different populations. And so we can look at the chimps and think about, if our ancestors were a little bit chimp-like, why did they innovate tools? And the standard answer here is to get more calories to feed ever larger brains that require lots of energy to optimize. But this is a weird thing. Because, if you look around at your peers, if you look at your students, I suspect you would say that there aren't many of them that are optimizing anything in their daily dietary choices. And so why do we think chimps would optimize when we don't optimize? And so if you think about going to the grocery store, whatever this aisle is, this is not optimizing. Or if it is optimizing, it's optimizing something we no longer need. And so it's curious we think that chimps optimize. And so what if instead our ancestors innovated tools? What if they used the tools to get more tasty foods, and those foods then happened on average to have more calories. And so they're using taste as an indicator of what they tend to need. But it's not optimization, they're guided by flavor and taste, and it tends to result in what they need over evolutionary time. And so what if these are tools of culinary pleasure? If that were the case, we can make certain predictions. So we would predict that sometimes chimps would eat things that taste good but aren't good for them. And we would also predict that they tend to eat things that are flavorful. And this, in theory, would be hard to test, except that we know that the taste receptors of chimps and humans are quite similar. So their sweet taste receptors are largely the same. Sour seem to be the same. Salt seem to be the same or very similar. The umami are very similar. And their bitter are different. And so for most of those taste receptors, if we eat something chimps eat and it's tasty, it's almost certainly tasty to them, unless it's bitter and then we don't know. And what's amazing is that one of the things chimpanzee biologists do all the time is they go around behind the chimps and they eat what the chimps eat. And the best at this was this Professor Toshisada Nishida, Japanese researcher, who started studying chimps basically at the same time as Jane Goodall at a site just 70 kilometers south of where Goodall worked in Gombe. And he worked at Mahale Mountain National Park, really very close enough that in theory the chimps could go from one to the other, at least every few generations. And so what did he find? He found after tasting many, many chimpanzee foods that the vast majority of fruits that they were eating were sweet. Some were sweet and sour, some were sour. A few were astringent, and so they make your mouth pucker. This is not the same as bitterness, it's a different thing. Some were bland or insipid, which is also true of lots of our foods. Some were sweet and bitter, but remember the ones that are bitter, we can't really say much about because our receptors are different. But in general, they seem to be tasty, and the sweetest fruits were the most preferred, both by Nishida and the chimpanzees. But they weren't totally delicious, and even the sweets weren't very sweet, instead a bit bland. And so in this context, it seems like they're choosing good tasting things, but it also seems like there might be tastier things they could potentially get to. And indeed, when we look at the foods that they procure with tools, they're almost always tastier. And so ants are sour, they have a nice mouthfeel. In the US, we don't eat ants, but around the world, most human cultures eat ants when there are tasty ants available and love them, eat them as a snack. And we know that the chimps get almost no calories from the ants. They're like a snack. Seaweed, we like it too. Honey, which the chimps get from bees, is sweeter than anything else in nature. And the same termites that the chimps eat, humans eat and love. And so it seems like these are tastier things. There could be other pieces here: appearance, olfaction, chemesthesis, sounds, interplay of the senses. These are all part of flavor, which includes taste but is broader. And we think that one of the reasons some chimp populations eat meat is to get this, is that it's salty. But maybe there are other pieces of that too, other flavor elements. But it seems like there's something there. But if taste is the guide rather than optimization, species might also be expected to sometimes eat things that taste good but do not benefit them. Does this happen? As I mentioned, it seems to happen with the ants. Ants are incredibly common in chimp diets, and yet there appears to be no nutritional benefit to eating the ants. Multiple people have studied this. Nishida concluded that they're simply snacks. And so this seems like pleasure, not like important dietary element. But the even more conspicuous case for me is work by Dr. Vittorio Etienne, where she studied chimps in Luango and Gabon. And in this site, chimps use great big poles to pound into the ground to get to ground nesting bees. And what Vittorio was able to show was that the chimps would sometimes dig for months or even years to get to these ground nesting bees. And when they did, they would get no more than about a half a liter of honey, so about 2,000 calories. And their social rule is they have to divide it with whoever else happens to be there. And so there's no way this digging for the honey is calorically a win. In fact, they almost certainly spend more calories getting the honey than they get from the honey. But the honey is delicious. This honey is thought of as one of the most delicious honeys in the world. And so it looks like they do it because it tastes good. The other example is that Maureen McCarthy and Jack Lester have studied chimps in this fragmented habitat in Uganda. And what they find is that very often, even when the chimps have population centers that are in forests, that they'll go out into sugarcane plantations and they'll eat sugarcane and they'll eat more sugarcane and they'll eat more sugarcane. And when they're done with that, they'll eat some jackfruits. And to the extent that they'll eat almost nothing else. And they think this is happening because they taste good to them. But it looks almost certain that it's not good for them, but it tastes good to them. They taste good to her. You can see it by the way she gives herself to the one half sucked out in her hand. But to me, the most conspicuous example here is this fruit, Pentadiplandra brasiliana. And so all African fruit-eating primates except gorillas seem to love these fruits, including humans. Humans love these fruits. I've been in multiple talks where somebody said, oh, I ate that growing up. It was delicious. But gorillas don't like this. What is happening? Well, what Elaine Guevara has shown is that this fruit doesn't actually produce sugar. Instead, it produces teeny quantities of a little teeny protein called brazein. And what you see in this figure is the sweet taste receptor. It looks like a little cup. The way it normally works is sucrose or glucose lands in that cup, triggers the receptor, it sends a signal. Well, what this protein, brazein, does is it goes around the edge of the protein of the receptor and kind of hits its little elbow there and triggers the sensation of sweetness, even though there's no sugar present. And the fruit can produce a tiny amount of this protein and make the fruit seem sweet. And what Elaine thinks has happened here is that at one point, gorillas ate so many of these fruits and were actually suffering. They were losing weight. Their babies were suffering because they weren't gaining weight, because they weren't getting the calories. That natural selection actually favored the gorillas with different sweet taste receptors that were no longer susceptible to this trick. And it was actually so comprehensive that all gorillas now have this other version of the taste receptor. So the model here is some of the gorillas like the falsely sweet fruit so much that their health suffered. Others like them less. The latter gorillas were more likely to thrive and reproduce. It's only their descendants that survive. And so this doesn't suggest optimal foraging. It suggests that we and our ancestors can make mistakes, as the candy aisle and the cereal aisle should make clear. And so I'm going to pause here for a couple of questions before I go on, but I'm going to transition us to thinking about big brains and culture when we resume. And so, Mike, do we have any questions we could pause on now?
Thank you. We actually have a few comments and questions. Everyone's sharing their thoughts. Abigail, who's one of our frequent attendees, mentioned that she loves to cook, and she cooks as a way to show how much she loves and cares about the people in her life. She thinks flavor such a crucial part of that, being that feeling of being loved. So thank you for sharing that, Abigail. There's also a question. In slide 71, you mentioned species eating things that don't benefit them, which gave me an opening for a question that came up about artificial flavors. And that question is from Monica, and she wonders how artificial flavoring, artificial sweeteners, how they factor into all of this. Is that a premature question, or is it something that you can respond to, particularly with the processed foods and the artificial sweeteners and flavors that are used in foods today? Is that something?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe I'll divide it into two pieces, and I'll answer one piece now and one piece later.
Good deal.
And Abigail, thanks for that comment. I think that I won't have a chance to talk about it today, but one of the things that makes humans different is the way we share food and talk about food. And that's actually a really important transition in our story, and that's it's a open question. What makes us humans different and special? And I think that sharing food, talking about food, being together around food, there are precursors of it in other primates, but nothing quite so special as what you mentioned, which I think is among the most beautiful things we have. But so to go back to the sweeteners, that brazein, that protein that tricks the sweet taste receptor, people are actually working on commercializing, and I'm not sure the status right now, versions of that as an artificial sweetener. Because on the one hand, the gorillas want to gain weight to be healthy, and we want to lose it. And so in the modern context, that trick is actually potentially quite interesting in food products. And so there's some work on that. And there are other compounds like that from other plants that do similar tricks. And so that's interesting. And so you could also imagine tricking the other receptors. And so I work with people thinking about the green transition. How do we get to more sustainable food systems? And they want to think about, how do we convince our taste receptors that plant-based foods have more umami than they do? Can we make plant-based foods seem meatier? And that's a really interesting thing right now. The question about processed foods, I'm going to sneak around to a little bit later when I come to olfaction and smelling. And somebody would keep me honest on that, Mike, if you can remind me to come back around to that. It's a very good question. And I'll telegraph a little bit and say that one of the things the companies are doing when they're selling us very processed foods is they're tapping into the way that we learn to like the flavors of foods, in particular the smells associated with the flavors. And so let me talk about that in a second, and I'll come right back to that great question.
Good deal. Well, thank you so much. Juliana, our TA, says that she says gotcha on the smell reminder, so she'll bring that up for you. And
thanks, Julie. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we'll move ahead. We're all enjoying it. It's so illuminating. I will say you've set the record in the first 15 minutes for the "wow, I didn't know that" responses. So.
Oh, good.
So thank you. We can move ahead. Thank you, Rob.
Well, I'm enjoying this too. So thank you everybody for being here. So now I'm going to quickly pivot and very quickly talk about one of the things that paleoanthropologists, anthropologists who study ancient humans most fight about. Like if you see them at a bar and they're in a heated argument, it is about this question. And the question is, when we look at our ancestors and we look at brain size, skull size, ancestors and relatives, and I can't see on my own screen, but so there's a phase in our evolutionary history when our ancestors had skulls that looked like most mammal skulls. And so here you see them here, they look pretty normal. And then we go through this evolutionary transition when we get these huge bulbous skulls that look like aliens. We love them because they're us, but if they weren't us, we would think they were really weird. And so this has really been a hot topic for evolutionary biologists for a long time. And one of the arguments about this is that part of what accounts for this transition is associated with the use of fire. And so once our ancestors could cook food, they could get more calories from that same food that allowed them to feed a bigger brain, and allowed a bigger brain to evolve, and allowed them to continue to use fire to cook things. And so this has been contentious because we don't know quite how long ago our ancestors used fire in a controlled way. But what's really interesting is underneath this hypothesis, Richard Wrangham had a sub-hypothesis that was sort of implicit, and that was that the reason our ancestors started to use fire is because once they cooked things, they were easier to chew and they tasted better. Think about a piece of raw wildebeest, chewy, not very satisfying, especially without spices. And think about a nice, freshly cooked piece of wildebeest that's got all those wonderful cooked meat odors, right? Do you want to go to your friend's house when they've had a barbecue or when they just have the meat on the grill? You want to go after the barbecue. And so Wrangham argues that pleasure was really important. And what we realized in writing this book is that in the passive-aggressive war of no, that hypothesis is wrong, that almost every argument for what happened that allowed our brains to evolve this big size related to pleasure, related to food. And so one hypothesis is our ancestors figured out how to gather more honey and get those calories. One hypothesis is that they figured out how to extract more meat from nuts and get those calories. Both of those things are delicious. And another hypothesis suggests they figured out how to open up mussels, or how to take roots out and roast them, or how to hunt meat. But everybody agrees, nobody agrees which of these things is right, but they all agree that the reason our ancestors would have done this is because those things tasted better. And so taste and then flavor, which is this more encompassing thing, are pretty central to this transition. And so this transition of big brains is somehow about a kind of act of creating, the act of transforming foods into more delicious foods. And this makes me think of this Jane Hirschfield poem in which she writes, "My species, even a small purple artichoke boiled in its own bittered and darkening waters, grows tender and sweet. Patience, I think my species keep testing the spiny leaves." And one way or another, we tested the spiny leaves, we tested the hard to get to mussels, and that transition had to do with flavor, with taste, is what we argue. And I could talk more about this. But that to me is really intriguing. But the other piece I want to get to come back to that question about processed foods is the origin of culture. And chimpanzees, we know, have something like culture. And this is the other thing the anthropologists like to debate, and it can be ferocious, passive-aggressively ferocious, but ferocious. Certainly, though, they have culinary traditions. Individual chimp populations eat different things, and their babies learn how to eat those different things and use tools to eat them. And so what accounts for those traditions? And what accounts for the fact, if you look at this map of chimpanzees, that each one of those populations is eating different things? And one of the things that strikes me in this context is if you look at Gombe National Park and Mahale National Park, which I introduced earlier, those are basically the same habitat. They have the same species. And yet in Gombe National Park, the chimpanzees tend to eat these ants, chromatogaster ants, which are pretty sour. And in Mahale National Park, they eat totally different ants, even though the same ants are present. And these are cultural traditions. And we know in some cases, because of archaeological evidence from the chimps, that some of these traditions have been passed down for as long as 1,000 years. And so what accounts for that? And what accounts for the ability of our ancestors as they moved out of Africa and around the world to be able to learn to eat different things in different places, to pass those traditions onto their children, to learn to gather around the fire, to gather around the table in a loving way, and to enjoy foods which at each place were somehow different. How does that happen? It could be genetic differences. There are some genetic differences among humans in taste and smell. It could, but I think that the more interesting thing is that learning to enjoy certain elements of certain flavors, but how? And the how relates to something called retronasal olfaction. And so when a dog goes out into the world, they use orthonasal olfaction. When they sniff things, they sniff them through the fronts of their noses, through their nostrils. And they're really good at it. They have airflow that maximizes it. We do that too, but it's not very conspicuous for us. Our faces are flattened. We pick up, if you walk and you smell bread, obviously that's that orthonasal olfaction. But the other thing is because of unusual characteristics of the human head, we also feature retronasal olfaction. And it's been argued by Daniel Lieberman at Harvard that we're probably the species in which retronasal olfaction is most powerful. Now, what is that? It's basically smelling your food once it's in your mouth. And so if you look at the cheese in this image, the lightweight molecules from that cheese go back up and around, and they hit smell receptor cells. And so once cheese is in your mouth, once pizza is in your mouth, once that cereal you're eating late at night because you couldn't find anything else is in your mouth, the smells are actually going through your mouth and into your nose. And that's probably more important to us than orthonasal olfaction. And most of flavor is that smell. It's that retronasal smell. But what's really interesting is while taste is almost all innate, it's instinctual. We're born with the sweetness tastes the way sweetness does, and we like it at birth. We can kind of modulate how much we like it through learning, but it's largely innate. As far as we understand, all of our preferences for smells are learned. And they're learned in this really interesting way that our brain, when it smells a new smell, it sort of puts it in the card catalog of our brain. And I'm dating myself here, but hopefully some of the rest of you remember these too. And so it gives it a catalog. And so if you smell blue cheese, it puts it in your brain, and it puts it next to the other thing it's most similar to. And as you go learning new smells, those keep getting divided more and more. So if you spend more time smelling cheese, you get more card catalog cards for cheese, and they're more and more finely divided. But the other thing that happens is that we learn a valence for that smell. Is it good or is it bad? And so if you associate a smell with a positive experience, it gets a good valence. You remember it as a good smell. And we kind of build up that good versus bad for each aroma, each set of aromas through our lifetime. And so you can imagine that as we were moving around global landscapes, that if we could learn to like particular smells that we associated with good memories, this would be a rapid way to learn new foods and then to share them with pleasure with your family. But what's even more amazing to me, and this gives me an oh wow, but I can't type and talk at the same time, is that this begins really early in life. In fact, it begins in utero. And there have now been a whole series of studies of humans and sheep, oddly, that show that when the fetus is in utero, it is learning which foods to like from its mother. And foods that the mother eats, the fetus and then baby learns are good foods. And so in one study in France, half of pregnant mothers in the study ate anise and half did not. And then they did a study where they put a cotton swab to the faces of these newborn babies. And what they found is the babies whose mother did, and the cotton swab had anise on it, and the babies whose mothers did not eat anise, the baby made that scrunchy face, the figure B. But the babies whose mothers ate anise when they were pregnant made the lick-lipping pleasure face or a nursing face. And so in utero, these babies, all babies, are learning what mom eats is good. And they learn those smells, and so they're born liking them. And subsequent studies have shown that if mothers eat garlic while pregnant, babies are born liking garlic. If they eat vegetables, the babies are more likely to be born liking vegetable smells. If they eat blue cheese, the babies are more likely to be born liking blue cheese smells, and even fermented fish. And so now imagine our ancestral communities in which not only could people rapidly learn which smells were associated with good experiences, but they could pass that on to their babies. And so that second generation is learning immediately. You're born learning, this is what my people love, which I think is very powerful. And at the same time, we know that there's a converse, which is that if you eat something and it makes you throw up, that in one moment you learn that to be a bad smell. It's called the Garcia effect. And I don't know anything else about Garcia who discovered it other than this. But you know, if you drank tequila when you were too young to drink tequila and you threw up and got really sick, you would learn in that one instance to not like the smell of tequila. And so it's a powerful response. And so we have these things going which help us to learn. And so we can imagine that culinary traditions are reinforced by this learning of aromas that are part of flavor and help their ancestors distinguish and choose from the foods around them, but also to create new foods. And for those of you who bring food into the classroom, this is really a powerful way to work with students, to teach them about the science of food, but also to teach them about how the brain works, to teach them to like new things. And we've done a lot of work in developing lesson plans and other things for fermented foods, and I'm glad if you want to reach out or look at our webpage to see any of those, but to help students build additional traditions about foods they love and think about. I'll pause again for questions, but Julianne reminded me somehow. So going back to the processed food question, what food companies have figured out is that they can take advantage of this. And so if they provide a simple smell that reminds us of their food, and that we associate that smell with a good experience, we learn very, very quickly to like it. And so if you've ever noticed how Subway sandwiches, they always smell the same. And if you had a good experience in Subway, you smell it and you think, oh, I could go in and have another good experience. That is a smell that is intentionally different from the smell of other breads. So you associate it specifically with Subway bread smell. Same with Burger King buns. If you smell them, they don't smell like other buns. That is intentional. And so if you look at foods in general, food companies are using this olfactory learning as a way to reinforce our pleasure. And there's some evidence that even connects to what we see on TV. And so if you see other people having Subway sandwiches, and I don't mean to pick on Subway, but it's a clear case, and they look happy, then you smile and you think Subway happy. And those things add up, and you come to love Subway, and you're not quite sure why. And so the food industry's figured this out, and so they've taken advantage of it to lead us to things. Sometimes those are good for us. The ads tell me Subway's very good for me. I don't know. Let's leave that to a different conversation. But also can lead us in worse directions. But I'll pause for questions. But thanks, Julianne, for subliminally reminding me.
Good job, Juliet. These are all great questions and comments. At the end of this session, Rob, I'll send you a copy of the audience chat so that you can review it. Awesome responses here. We have a question. We received it shortly after the first question break, but it's from Hope. Her question is about ants. Even though they have little nutritional value, what role does texture play? Could that be why they're so popular with primates?
What a good question. Who was the question?
That's from Hope.
Thank you, Hope.
Yeah, that's from Hope out of Van Gogh Charter Elementary School.
Thank you, Hope. So there's a phenomena that I work a lot with chefs, which is it's a very fun part of my job. And chefs talk about something called mouthfeel. And mouthfeel encompasses texture. And so that crunchiness of a potato chip or an ant. And there are clearly some textures we really like. And I actually think that that texture is a very important part of which foods animals choose, clearly in humans, but also in other species. And this allows me to introduce quickly the avocado, because avocados don't have a ton of taste, actually. And they have a little bit of aroma that's often described as green. But the reason we find them so pleasurable is they actually have a wonderful mouthfeel. There's that smooth fatness, and so you eat a toasted bread with that smooth avocado. But that's not taste, and that's not flavor as we tend to think of it. That's mouthfeel. Now, what's really intriguing about that is avocado fruits evolved to be dispersed. And so the fruit itself is the food for an animal that would eat it, and an animal eats it and disperses the seed somewhere else. It's a big seed, so whatever eats it, it would be a big thing. And it used to be thought that the dispersers for avocados in the wild were extinct megafaunas, like gomphotheres and mammoths. But recently it's been observed that avocado orchards in Mexico are often full of wild cats, and so margais and sometimes even jaguars that sneak up and eat the avocados. And so it looks like one possibility is that the avocados may have evolved to have a texture that was a little bit like some kinds of meat that was pleasing for carnivores. And this hasn't been tested, but it's an intriguing possibility. And the role of texture evolutionarily has really not been studied very much, except that we know some things have textures animals don't like. You don't eat something that's really spiny. But Hope, that's a great question, and I think there are lots of fun experiments you could do with students on that. Don't feed them spines, but otherwise they're fun experiments to do there.
Very good. Thank you for that. Allison had a question. She said, could you address the concept of different cultures and tastes and the development of cuisines associated with different ethnicities? Allison says that she teaches a course on ethnicity and American history, and she would love to integrate food culture into her course. Similarly, there was earlier a question that came up about the connection between climate and taste as well. But her question goes to the concept of different cultures and taste in the development of cuisines associated with different ethnicities.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll do it partial justice quickly here, but I think it's very interesting. And I'll say one place this comes up is that there are a lot of foods that in Western European cultures people came to not like or never liked, and then during waves of colonialism, those foods were stigmatized globally. And so one of the things that we're starting to come to terms with now is that there were a lot of foods that were liked around the world that we've kind of lost or become hidden because of the Western palate, which there are some genetic differences, but I think largely is culture plus that sort of olfactory learning. And one of those foods is fermented meat. And so historically, we know that many hunter-gatherer populations fermented meat and loved it. And there's some evidence, for example, of fermented mastodon and mammoth in North America. But going back to the Clovis people, fermented fish are obviously common around the world. But I work a fair amount with a colleague, Evia Hoffman, who's Greenlandic and works on Greenlandic food systems. And so I would point you to some of her work, because what she's starting to do is to lift up and retell the story of Greenlandic and more broadly indigenous food systems and flavors, and the ways in which thinking about those flavors allows us to think about history and culture and colonialism. And so the example there is that in Greenland, many kinds of fermented meats are eaten that for Westerners are often viewed as kind of stinky and even, I'm doing air quotes, which you can't see in audio, disgusting. And it's clear that that's a learned phenomenon, but it's had huge impacts on Greenlandic people and how their food is seen. And so I think they're really interesting things to talk about in your class there. And then I would also say, that as we look globally, food systems and preferred foods, they differ much more radically than we tend to think. There's a tendency to take our own foodways for granted and to not realize how different they can be. And so I would say there's a lot of interesting and tragic history associated with the ways that people use foods as a cultural identity, but also the ways that those identities are maligned and marginalized, and the important role those food differences play. And I think to me, it's really amazing that those food differences, from an evolutionary perspective, are really recent. Most of them are the last 12,000 years, which from an evolutionary perspective is like yesterday. And so in 12,000 years, humans have invented all of these beautiful ways to make different foods that appeal in different and unique ways. And what an interesting moment we have when we can taste foods from around the world and think about our own preferences and global preferences and how those relate to each other. I could talk more about this, but I'll stop there. But it's a great question and a rich area.
Good deal, Rob. Thank you for taking those questions. We have about 30 more minutes remaining, so let's move ahead. I mean, this is so fascinating, and thank you. We're looking forward to more.
Thanks so much, Mike, and thanks for these great questions. They're really amazing. So I'm going to turn a little bit here and turn to this next book, A Natural History of the Future. And it's a very different kind of book in many ways, but the thing that's shared here is a recognition that understanding of the details of our biology helps us to understand both the past and the ways in which we can explore the future. And now I'm going to talk briefly about our relationship to other species that live on and with us. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about climate, and then I'm going to try to bring all those pieces back in the end to ask you as a group, what are the kinds of futures that we want as we think about our bodies, our past, and the extraordinary possibilities for what's next. And so I'm going to talk first about our dependence on the rest of life. And I think it's really easy when Elon Musk is flinging himself into space or flinging other people into space, and technology seems all dominant, to imagine ourselves as in control of everything, and to imagine that all the rest of life depends on us. And so this Calder sculpture, we imagine ourselves to be at the top. And the reality is, missing the slide. The reality is we're more like one of those bottom pieces on the sculpture. But this is not how we think. This is not, the Elon Musk spaceship to the sky. It's not the Bezos spaceship model. And yet the reality is that's where we are in the story. And this is something very early in my career that I saw not in humans, but in thinking about and studying termites. And so the termite on the top is the queen. She's physogastric, which is a kind way of saying she's got a big bottom full of eggs. The middle individual is the king, and the bottom individual is the worker. And the thing we've known about termites since the late 1800s is that they depend on bacteria in their guts to digest their food, and those bacteria depend on them. And they're actually, in many cases, mutually unculturable. We can't grow the termites without their microbes, or the microbes without their termites. And we also know that when these queens and kings fly to found new colonies, that they take these microbes with them. They depend on them, and they carry them with them. What we've seen in the last 10 years is that in the human story, we're way more like the termites than we thought, and that we are just as dependent on the species that live on us and around us. And so if you think about your own body, many features of the way your body works are not your body's own cells. And so your behavior, your way of thinking about the world is influenced by which chemicals the microbes in your gut release, and those chemicals go up to your brain. Your digestion is carried out by your gut microbes. Your skin microbes, if coronaviruses are floating around your house, the first thing they hit is not your immune system. It's actually the microbes on your skin that act like a first line of defense. And on, right? And we started to realize that the importance of these species when we started to screw them up. And so we're now seeing all kinds of problems in human health associated with failing to get the right species of microbes. And so we're not getting them during birth, especially in C-section births. We're not getting them if we aren't exposed to the soil enough, and we're not getting them if we don't interact enough with plants. And as a result, we get inflammatory skin problems such as rosacea. We get skin infections like MRSA. We get ear infections. We get some kinds of cavities that are related to changes in microbes, inflammatory bowel, Crohn's disease, nutritional deficiencies, obesity, poor mental health. None of these are exclusively caused by changes in which species we have in our body, but they're all influenced by which species we have in our body. Same for allergy, asthma, MS, and many other diseases associated with increases in immune reactivity. And so what we're seeing in the last decades is that we depend on being exposed to the right species and carrying them with us into the future. And in addition, we consume tens of thousands of species of plants and animals, each of which is dependent on tens or more of other species. And so if we think about flinging ourselves into space, or if we think about Elon Musk in space, maybe he could make a colony on Mars or on the moon. But if he does, he's going to do it with skin microbes and gut microbes from his mother during birth. He's going to do it with an immune system primed by exposure to soil microbes and leaf microbes. And he's going to do it while eating food that's largely grown on Earth and depends on bees for pollination. And then, at least as we do it right now, the International Space Station astronauts, when they come back to Earth, they bring their feces with them, because right now the easiest thing to do is have a decomposed by Earth organism. And so far from being so independent, we're very dependent. We're very part of the rest of this living, extraordinary living world, in which we don't know how many species there are, but one recent estimate, and we could talk more about this, suggests 1 trillion species of bacteria alone. What's amazing to me is only 30,000 are named. And so when a termite queen flies, she needs to carry her microbes. When we fly, we have to carry everything. And we also have to carry the species in which we might sometimes depend but don't yet depend. And so this is another way in which the details of our biology influence our daily lives in ways we might not be thinking about. And so the ancient story of flavor influences the decisions we make, but so do these interactions with species we might not even know are there. And it's a lot of species. And so if everybody, you're going to have to humor me because I can't see you. Breathe in deeply for a moment. As you did, you inhaled roughly 1,000 species. No more than 100 of those have been named, and no more than 10 of those have been studied in any detail. But some of those species you depend upon for your very existence. And so we're humble before the grandeur of the living world around us. And then we're also dependent in other ways. We're dependent on our evolutionary history. And we're dependent in the context of climate. And so a number of years ago, we started working on a quirky thing, which was trying to understand the temperatures and the humidities that people preferred in their houses. And so we started to study, okay, what temperature do you feel just totally pleased at? You know, oh, this is the right temperature. The world is all well. And then what's the temperature at which you think, oh, I'm a little bit uncomfortable, but I'm too lazy to get up and do anything? And then what's the temperature at which you say, oh, this is really unpleasant, I need to do something? Or the temperature at which you say, oh, I can't do work outside. And then the temperature at which you say, which your health is actually threatened. Well, all of those temperatures, it turned out, each of which has a name, we've discovered that they evolved in a relatively ancient time period. They started to evolve about 2 million years ago. They're sort of in their modern form by 300,000 years ago. And so they're a really ancient feature of our biology. And so this is like a fun, quirky thing I studied, and I was really interested in it, but how does it possibly matter? And it's a thing we can study thinking about chimps and their preferences too, which is what we've done. Well, it turns out to matter if we think about the effects of changing temperatures on human societies. And what we've started to see is that even as we get to temperatures that are slightly unpleasant, the aspects of human society change fundamentally. And as you get to temperatures where you think, well, I might not work outside, that at those temperatures, conflicts start to increase. We start to see decreases in GDP in countries. And so if you look at change in temperature through time in a country, in the years it gets hot, following those years, gross domestic product, so the wellness of the economy decreases. If you're above a certain sort of optimal temperature. If you're below that temperature, if you're in Iceland, when temperatures increase, conflicts go down and GDP goes up. And so there's this temperature at which things are well. And that's an ancient temperature that relates to our ancient history. But it also influences many things about our lives today. Oops. Because what we're finding is that we look at climate change globally, more and more places on Earth are moving into conditions that are outside of those temperatures where we feel happy. They're beyond the temperatures at which we feel like we can work, and they're even into the temperatures at which we can no longer do work without our health being threatened. And the reason for that is this ancient feature of our biology and our preferences for temperatures. And one of the hard realities of this is that, so I'm going to walk you through this figure slowly, is it's very non-random who is going to experience these temperatures out of sync with our bodies and who is not. And so on the x-axis, what you can look at is the emissions per capita is the key thing on the x-axis. And so if you go to the right, these are countries with more emissions per person. And so the US has lots of greenhouse gas emissions. Qatar actually has more oil production. And you go to the left, these are countries with less in the way of greenhouse gas emissions. The points are color-coded by poverty. We don't have to focus on that now. And then the y-axis is the number of people in millions that are going to be exposed to temperatures that are potentially dangerous with some frequency. And what you can see in the bottom right is the US and the EU are two of the regions that are contributing the most to emissions, but they're two of the regions that are going to experience some of the fewest negative effects of the warming itself per se. Obviously, it's regional. The California experience is different than the Montana experience, but on average. On the other hand, Nigeria has contributed very little to global emissions, but is going to be really negatively affected in terms of the number of hours and days and people exposed to these extreme conditions. And this has economic features, it has public health features, it has inequality and colonial features, but at its heart, it has physiology. And so we don't escape that physiology fully. And so if I pull the flavor story and the biodiversity story of the species we depend on and then the story of our physiology together, I think one of the things I think a lot about moving forward is that we need to design futures that respect and respond to the details of our evolutionary histories, the consequences of which will persist so long as our genome remains unaltered. And of course, people are working to alter human genomes. The lab in China that created 2 human transgenic babies that are now, I guess they're young girls right now. That the person who ran that lab was imprisoned. That person's now been released, and his lab has been restarted. And so transgenic human work is happening. At some point, our genomes are likely to be edited. But until then, our taste receptors are going to be very similar well into the future. Our ability to learn aromas that are going to be similar. Our thermal physiology is going to be similar, and our need for other species is going to be similar. And so as we pull together these 2 books and these 2 different kinds of stories, the question for you is, given the role of flavor in our decision making and the ways in which our relationship with other species and our physiology constrain us, how do we think about creating better futures, better foods, better cities, better daily lives? And I'll say that these are not questions, these are questions I can't answer as a scientist. They're public questions, artist questions, writer questions, everyone questions. And so one of the things we're doing at NC State is to try to bring people together. And I'd love to see in the chat your ideas for what should our futures look like. But we're trying to bring speculative fiction writers together with artists, together with scientists, so we can think not about what's the future that we get tomorrow, but what are the possible futures that we could have while keeping the realities of our bodies in mind. What's that range of futures, so that when we work with our students, we can think about, what future do you want to work toward? As a young person in the US, around the world, what do you want to build? And I think we're really good at scaring our kids about the negative features of the future, but we're not very good at enlisting their help and thinking about the future they want to make. What particularities should it have? And so I'd love to think about collaborations or ways to work together with you and your students to help imagine those better futures, because that's an everyone question. Mike, do we have a couple minutes? If we do, I could either do questions or I can talk about fermentation for a second. And I'm glad to do either one.
You know what? I'm reading the comments, and everyone this is so fascinating. We're enjoying it. I would love to hear more about fermentation. I'm looking here, and Sherry says simply, I love this webinar. Like, we are enjoying this so much. So if you would like to delve a little bit further or go into fermentation. Josh said more fermentation, so please go ahead. We're fine.
All right, I'm going to tip ahead. And both these things, different books, but the features of these are in the books. Also, some of this is elsewhere. So fermentation. So one of the questions, and this is going to relate back to flavor, is when do our ancestors start to ferment, and how do we think about fermentation? So I've been thinking about this for a long time. And one of the contexts in which we've been thinking about it is in the context of thinking about, well, when could our ancestors have started to ferment? And most of the discussion is argued that, well, once they started to domesticate grains, they settled in Mesopotamia and Indus River Valley and parts of China, later settled in the Americas in persistent agricultural populations, then they started to ferment things. Then they started to brew. But one of the interesting things that Liz Mallett and Katie Amato have discovered is that there are capuchin monkeys, like this one you see here, so named because of that tonsure of their head, that nice little head cap, that gather these almendra fruits, climb high into trees to get them, and then throw them on the ground. And the first time Liz Mallett saw this, she had no idea what they were doing, and they spent enormous energy doing it, and these are hard fruits that the monkeys couldn't eat. And so they threw a ton of them on the ground, and then they disappeared. And so, Liz thought, oh, another mystery in monkey land. And then what she saw is she came back a little bit later, 3 weeks later, and saw the monkeys eating the fruits that had rotted for 3 weeks. And she said they smelled like a kind of slightly alcoholic kombucha. And she then saw these capuchin monkeys do this repeatedly. And so it actually looks like these capuchin monkeys might be intentionally fermenting these fruits so as to make them more edible and pleasurable. And so this opens the question, if the capuchin monkeys could do it, why couldn't our ancestors? And the more we dug into this, the more we saw evidence that maybe this was actually more common before agriculture than we once thought. And there's an old article by Daniel Fisher in which he argues that maybe mammoths were fermented by Clovis people in the Americas. And Dan came to this idea on the basis of discovering mammoths in ponds in North America that seemed to be associated with rocks and almost looked like they were tethered to the bottom of the pond. And so he started thinking, well, what if what was going on is you kill a mammoth or a mastodon, and there's just so much meat, right? You've got a family of 20 or 30. You eat all you can. You feel like actually sick with mammoth. And then there's still a bunch left over. How do you store it? Well, what if you push it in the pond and it ferments there, and then you can go and get it whenever you want? And so Dan did what experimental archaeologists did. And so a friend of his had a horse that died. Dan took paleo tools that he had made, butchered the horse, and he put it in a pond. And then when he went back and sampled it every month for half a year, and what he found is that even 6 months later, it was edible. And in fact, especially when cooked a little bit, it had a flavor like Stilton cheese and steak all in one. And so it looked like it had been preserved by lactic acid bacteria. And so maybe our ancestors were preserving in this way. And so imagine that with fermentation, one learns the right smell, the bodily smell of a good ferment, and the acts that engender that smell, which in turn become encoded in rituals and norms. And much as doctors could once sniff out a sick patient, cooks could sniff out a bad ferment. And the really intriguing part about this, it's all just intriguing, and increasingly it looks like all the evidence points to fermentation being before agriculture. The oldest evidence of beer is now 12,000 years ago, before agriculture. The oldest bread is 14,000 years. The oldest meat appears 40,000 years. And so it almost looks like our ancestors had to start to farm grains so that they could make more of their brews. But the other intriguing part about this, I think a lot about microbes, is where were the microbes coming from that did this? And we started thinking about this some. We did an experiment with bakers from around the world. We had them make the same sourdough starter, and what varied was they had their hands. And we wanted to figure out, did the baker's hands contribute microbes to the sourdough starter, and did that influence flavor? And what we found was it did. And so the bakers had what in Korean is called salma, a hand flavor. And so it looks like the body microbes of the bakers are contributing to making the sourdough work. But the other thing we discovered is that we looked at the hands of the bakers, is that they were like no hands we'd ever studied before. Most of your hands, if you're not baking every day, have almost no yeast and maybe 3 to 6% lactic acid bacteria. The bakers had up to 70% yeast and 70% lactic acid bacteria. They were like a big loaf of bread. And so the baking had changed them. And so imagine we come to love our foods, but we also kind of start to smell like our foods. We're loving ourselves. We're loving our community. And we now know that yogurt microbes seem to be mostly body microbes. Chicha microbes seem to be body microbes. And increasingly around the world, we're seeing that many of the microbes employed in fermentation are actually part of what we call the extended microbiome, this extension of self. And what's interesting in the context of flavor is both that aroma piece, we're learning to love ourselves, our food, these smells that we associated with safety and pleasure, but also sour taste. And in my lab, one of the things we've recently discovered in a big study we did a couple of years ago, and first study ever on the evolution of sour taste, is that most mammal species, and indeed most vertebrates, don't like acidic foods. Even a teeny bit of acidity they avoid. And so in most vertebrates, sourness is bad. You taste a little bit, you walk away. If you put kombucha out for a dog, the dog will not love it. And probably somebody's going to chat me that their dog loves kombucha. That would be interesting. We could follow up. But in general, most vertebrates don't. But our common ancestors with chimps, gorillas, and orangutans appear to have evolved a preference for sour tastes. At the same time, they evolved a new lactic acid receptor in their guts and throughout their bodies that's just recently been discovered, and you all have it. And that receptor detects lactic acid, and when it does, it tells the immune system, calm down, we've got something good, you don't have to fight it. And it tells the body, stop burning fat, we have sugar, we don't need the fat. And so it looks like that receptor evolved to detect fermented foods and to tell the body they were good. And at more or less the same time, give or take a million years, these things are a little wiggly, our ancestors also evolved a version of the gene that breaks down ethanol and turns it into sugar that's 40 times faster than the earlier ancestors had. And so we see all these responses in our bodies that look like very early responses to more ingestion of fermented foods. And you say, well, why would that happen? And what we know about fermented foods that are alcoholic or acidic is that they're dominated, so acidic foods are dominated by bacteria producing acid, and that acidity kills other bacteria and makes those foods safe. And foods that are alcoholic are dominated by yeast, and the alcohol from those yeasts kills other microbes and makes the food safe. And so if we could detect acidity and like it, if we could enjoy alcohol and like it, we were finding safe foods that provided consistent sources of calories, and we were also starting to fumble with transformations of foods. And so this is a really active area of research, but I find it very, very intriguing. And so I will close there in case there are some fermentation questions, but what a pleasure to be with you today.
Oh, this has been so fascinating. Thank you so much, Rob. We truly appreciate it. There are lots of comments that I've been collecting throughout the evening. As I mentioned to you earlier, my plan is to send you a copy of the chat. But just thank you so much for the evening, for your investment of time. I will tell you that our webinar series, we focused this year on being more expansive as far as our topics, and you have just really ignited a passion in understanding deliciousness and flavor among our teachers, and you'll see it from the comments throughout the evening. But we appreciate you, and I honestly look forward to connecting with you, having conversations in the future. You and I are not very far away from each other, so hopefully we'll be able to set up a lunch and continue this conversation. I will say, I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say we appreciate it. We appreciate how you guided us in understanding how deliciousness has influenced most and perhaps all of the major evolutionary transitions in humans. And so we thank you for that. Our time, we are right at 8:30 now, so we will prepare to close out. If you take a look at the audience chat, you will see that everyone, they're very complimentary and thankful for you spending your time with us this evening. For everyone who's here, I'd encourage you all to keep up with what's happening at the National Humanities Center through our various social media feeds to get updates on what's going on and our activities, ongoing programming. I'll also invite you to check out our next webinar, which is scheduled for October the 17th, Hip Hop and Youth Culture as Pedagogy, with Jason Rawls, School of Music, African and African American Studies, The Ohio State University. Again, we appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule. I hope you enjoyed this evening as much as I did. The video will be available on demand, and trust me, I will extend another invitation to Dr. Dunn to come back in and talk with us again in the future, because we truly enjoyed it. Everyone, take care and be well, and have a great weekend. I hope it's restful and restorative for you all. And special request, Charles Mingus, Pithecanthropus erectus. Rob, I hope I got that correct.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right.
This is a piece about human evolution, and it is amazing. Thank you all.
And you're a great DJ as well, Rob.